Terminator Salvation, From the Ashes. A novel by Timothy Zahn. Chapter 7. Never panic. Orozco's frequently repeated warning echoed through Kyle's mind as the 6 teens spread out into a loose semicircle and started toward the 3 of them. Never, ever panic. But it was very hard not to. He and Orozco had guns of their own, but they were still holstered at their sides. The teens' 2 guns were already out and aimed. "Take it easy," Orozco called again. "There's no need for trouble." "Maybe we like trouble," the leader retorted. He had pulled a couple of paces ahead of the rest of his pack. His revolver pointed at Orozco's stomach as he strode toward his victims. "Maybe so, but I'll bet your buddies would rather have goodies than broken bones," Orozco countered, reaching behind him to give Kyle a gentle but imperative push backward and a little to the right. Star plucked at Kyle's sleeve. Now, Kyle muttered, trying desperately to come up with a plan. If he took a long step to his right, the direction Orozco had just nudged him, he would end up with the burrow between him and the main group of teens. That might at least give him a chance to draw his Colt, and even the odds a little. But no, that wouldn't work. Even though the burrow might block shots coming from that direction, Kyle would still be exposed to the kid with the revolver standing down the street. Unless Orozco was planning to block that line of fire with his own body. Was that what the little push had meant? Was Kyle supposed to duck into shelter and try to take down as many of the attackers as he could before one of them got Orozco, or him, or Star? There was another tug at Kyle's arm, even more insistent than the first. "What?" Kyle bit out, glaring at her. Her eyes met his evenly, her hands tracing out a single word: empty. Kyle frowned. Empty? What was that supposed to... And then he got it, and his eyes lifted from Star to the gun pointed at them from down the street. To the gun, and the faint hints of light he could see peeking coyly through the revolver's cylinder. The gun was empty. Kyle looked back at the gang leader, still bearing down on Orozco. Was his gun empty too? The kid was holding it low, pointed at Orozco's waist instead of his chest or head, too low for Kyle to see if its cylinder was also empty. But it almost didn't matter. The minute the boy reached them and got his hands on either Orozco's Beretta or Kyle's Colt, he would have a loaded gun. If Kyle was going to do something, he had to do it right now. The kid was nearly there, his free hand reaching toward Orozco's holster. Setting his teeth, Kyle took a quick step to the right, ducked down behind the burro's side, and yanked out his Colt. "Freeze!" he ordered. The gang leader's head snapped toward Kyle, his eyes burning with surprise and rage, his gun swiveling toward this sudden new threat. As he did so, Orozco took a half step forward. And in a haze of motion that Kyle never did completely figure out, the gang leader was spun 180 degrees around, his gun hand yanked up behind his back with the revolver pointed harmlessly down the street, and Orozco's left arm snaking its way around the kid's neck to press tightly against his throat. "Like my friend says," Orozco said, "freeze." "Let him go!" the gunman down the street snarled, jabbing his empty revolver threateningly toward Orozco as he and his friends unglued themselves from their positions and charged toward the would-be victims. There was a sudden muffled crack from the direction of the gang leader's twisted arm. The kid cried out in pain, and his revolver thudded onto the broken pavement. An instant later, Orozco had released the kid's wrist, drawn his Beretta, and had his arm crooked around the front of the leader's face, with the gun pointed toward the 2 incoming teams. "We only say freeze twice," he warned quietly. The boys came to a sudden halt. "Join the group," Orozco invited them, twitching the Beretta's muzzle toward the 5 who were still spread out in front of him. "Put the gun on the ground first." Silently, the 2 teens complied. Orozco's Beretta followed them the whole way over to the rest of the pack, and now there were 7 sets of hate-filled glares washing at Kyle over the muzzle of his Colt. "Here's how it's going to work," Orozco said into the brittle silence. "You're going to put down your weapons, all of them, and you're going to walk away, and you're not going to come back, ever." The leader began cursing. Orozco tightened his grip slightly around the other's neck, and the swearing abruptly stopped. "That's the easy way," Orozco continued. "The hard way is that we make sure you don't bother us again by killing all of you." He cocked back the hammer on the Beretta. "Right now." Kyle felt sweat gathering on the back of his neck. He'd seen Orozco use this same threat on other gangs, and so far, all of them had backed down. What if this one didn't? Would Kyle be able to cold-bloodedly open fire on another human being if they decided to make a fight of it, even to save his own life? Beside him, he felt Star brush his arm, and with that, all the questions and indecision faded into a cold determination, because he wouldn't just be protecting himself. He would be protecting Star. And whatever it took, he would do that. Whatever it took. Maybe the other teens saw the subtle change in his face. Maybe they didn't, but had just finished running the odds. Whichever it was, one of them took a deep breath and dropped his knife onto the pavement. A moment later, a second followed suit, and then a third, until all of them were standing unarmed, looking forlorn and a little ridiculous, as they continued to glare with impotent rage. "Good," Orozco said, removing his arm from the leader's throat. He gave the kid a shove toward the rest of the group. The kid stopped a couple of feet in front of the pack and turned around, adding his glare to the others as he clutched his wrist. "I suggest you head south," Orozco went on. "The population density goes down as you get closer to Nuke Zero, so there should still be places where you can carve out a home for yourselves, and the radiation should be well below danger levels by now." "Like we care about that even when we're starving to death," one of them muttered. "There's still plenty of food to be had for the scrounging," Orozco assured him. "Or you can starve if you'd rather. Makes no difference to me." Abruptly, Kyle heard the sound of running feet coming from his left. He turned to see Wadley and 3 more moldering Lost Ashes men appear around the corner, rifles and shotguns at the ready. The teens saw them too, and with that the last thoughts of resistance or treachery crumbled away. They might be vicious and depraved, but the fact they had survived this long proved they weren't stupid. "But wherever you go," Orozco went on, "please believe me when I say that you have no future in this neighborhood." The leader's eyes came reluctantly back to Orozco. "Yeah, we got it," he bit out. "Good," Orozco said. "Now go collect whatever you've got in your flophouse and hit the road. I'll give you half an hour. After that, if we see any of you around here again, you'll be shot on sight." "Go to hell," the leader muttered, but the words had no fire behind them, only dull resignation. "I'm already there," Orozco said grimly. "So is everyone else. Save your strength for fighting Skynet and the Terminators, not your fellow humans." The kid snorted. "Right." "I'm serious," Orozco insisted. "You like leading? Fine, we need leaders. But lead a resistance cell, not a gang." The kid just grunted and turned his back, pushing his way through the rest of the group. He stomped back into their flimsy gang house. One by one the others followed, some of them glancing at Orozco as they went, others ignoring him completely. They had all disappeared inside by the time Wadley and the others arrived. "You okay?" Wadley asked, panting as he trotted to a halt. "The sentry signaled that you were in trouble." "We were, but not anymore," Orozco assured him. "Thanks for the timely arrival. Made it much easier to convince them to vacate the premises." "Let's hope so," Wadley growled. "What about that stuff?" He gestured at the knives and revolvers scattered around the street. We'll take it with us, Orozco said. Kyle, you and Star go gather everything up. You can put it in that extra bag on the burro's harness. Sure, Kyle said. Gesturing to Star, he holstered his Colt and grabbed the bag. Walking around the burrow, he went to the abandoned weapons and started collecting them. One of the knives in particular caught his eye, and he took a moment to heft it in his hand, feeling the weight nestle comfortably in his grip. A couple of the teens, he had noticed, had held their knives like they really knew what they were doing. Carefully setting the weapon in the bag with the others, Kyle made a mental note to ask Orozco about that later. Orozco had already taught him how to shoot and make explosives. Maybe later Kyle could learn how to fight with a knife, too. The sun was setting behind a line of drab, pink-edged clouds when Blair finally arrived at the new hangar where she and Yoshi had stashed their A-10s. Considering the shape her plane had been in when she delivered it to Wince last night, she'd expected to find the place buzzing with activity. But the big open space was quiet and dark, with no hum of grinding wheels or flicker of welder fire. "Hello?" She called softly into the darkness, stepping back to put her shoulder blades against the wall beside the door, her hand dropping to the grip of her Desert Eagle. "Anyone home?" There was another moment of silence. Then a shadow behind her A-10 shifted subtly, and Wince's familiar shock of white hair appeared around the tail. "Oh," he said. "It's you. You were expecting someone else?" Blair growled, looking around the otherwise deserted hangar. This was not the level of security they were supposed to have around here. "Yoshi, actually," Wince said. "He's been here all day, and I finally sent him back to the bunker to get some sleep. But you know how well he obeys that kind of order." "About as well as you do?" "About that, yes," Wince agreed. "But since you're here and he isn't, could you give me a hand?" "What do you need?" Blair asked, keeping her grip on the Desert Eagle as she headed toward him. If there was someone back there holding a gun on the old man. But she rounded the tail to find that Wince was indeed alone. "I'm trying to get this attached without attracting attention," he told her, pointing to a replacement armor plate lying beneath an open section of her A-10's tail, a section completely surrounded by bullet holes. Those HKs last night had really done a job on her plane. "HKs have been buzzing the neighborhood all afternoon," Wince continued, "and I've been afraid to fire up the welders." "So what are you going to use, duct tape?" Blair asked, eyeing the hole. It looked way too small for the plate Wince was planning to jam into it. "Close," Wince said with a grin as he pried the top off an unlabeled 1-quart can. "I'm going to glue it in." Blair cocked her head. "You're kidding." "Well, temporarily anyway," he said. "Tomorrow, when I don't have to worry so much about stray light leaking out, I'll do a proper welding, but the glue should hold it together until then." "Okay," Blair said, looking at all the other bullet holes on the tail, as the scent of the adhesive curled her nose hairs. Wince's inventory included some of the worst-smelling concoctions in all of creation. "Don't you think you should take off all those other plates before you glue this one down?" "By that I assume you mean I should take them off so that I can replace them?" Wince suggested as he selected a paintbrush and started to layer the glue onto the exposed section of fuselage. "I'd love to do just that. Problem is, we haven't got anything to replace them with." Blair looked at the other damaged plates. "Oh." "It's worse than just oh," Wince said grimly. "Another round like last night and you and Connor can say goodbye to any hope of continuing air support. My inventory of spare parts and armor is going fast. And as for jet fuel, we're down to a single fill-up each." He glanced over at her. "Just between us, I'm starting to get a bit concerned." "Join the club," Blair said. "I just hope we'll find some useful stuff in that depot." "The Skynet staging area?" Wince said, nodding. Yes, Yoshi told me about that. Sounds perfectly insane if you ask me.
No argument there, Blair agreed. But it's better than going out with a whimper. Besides, in theory, all the Terminators will be out making trouble when Connor hits it.
Wince snorted. In theory, right. Famous last words if I've ever heard 'em.
Maybe, maybe not, Blair said. You ever hear that bumblebees can't fly?
Unscientific urban legend, Wince scoffed, studying his new layer of glue and reaching the brush in to touch up a few spots. There's not enough wing surface if the bumblebee functioned like a fixed-wing aircraft, but its wings actually work more like reverse-pitch semi-rotary helicopter blades. You get a lot more lift that way. Obviously more than enough for a bumblebee to tootle along just fine.
That's my point, Blair said. Skynet's got its rules and logic, and if we play by them, it'll eventually grind us down. So we have to find new ways and new logic.
Such as hitting a staging area?
Exactly.
Wince shook his head. I'm just a simple country mechanic. Okay, I think we're ready. You get that end of the plate, and I'll take this end. Lying on the floor, the plate had looked much bigger than its intended hole. Once held up to the gap, though, it turned out to be precisely the correct size.
Now what?
Blair asked as she and Wince pressed it into place. We need to hold it there for a minimum of 15 minutes, Wince said. I hope you didn't have anything else you wanted to do just now.
I think I can spare a bit from my busy schedule, Blair said, especially given that it's my plane you're putting back together.
The minutes dragged slowly by. Blair pressed against her end of the plate, feeling the warmth of Wince's shoulder nearby. The silence of the hangar and the city beyond it settled in around her, the smell of oil and metal and adhesive tingling at her nostrils. Her stomach grumbled once, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since breakfast, and the plate began to feel increasingly heavy as her arm and shoulder muscles started to fatigue. On the theory that the glue must surely be ready to take some of the strain, she shifted to pressing against the plate with only one hand at a time. It seemed to help. Why Hickabick? Wince asked suddenly. Blair frowned sideways at him.
What?
Your call sign, Wince said. I've wondered about it for months, only I never think about it when you're actually around to ask.
It's an acronym, Blair told him. HKBK. Hunter Killer Butt Kicker. Throw in some vowels so you can actually pronounce it, and it comes out Hickabick.
Cute, Wince said. A little mild, though, isn't it? I mean, why not go with Hunter Killer Ass Kicker? Let's see. HKAK, Hickak? Works even better.
Blair turned her eyes back to the plate, a hard lump forming in her throat. It's already taken, she said, trying to keep the old pain out of her voice. A friend of mine had it. Pete Teague. He was killed by the HKs a month before I joined Connor's group.
Oh, Wince said quietly. I'm sorry.
It's okay, Blair said. But, like I said, that was his call sign. I can't use it.
Because it's his memorial?
Something like that, Blair said. Probably sounds silly.
No, not at all, Wince assured her. Thank you for sharing that. The room fell silent again. Blair found herself staring at Wince's hands as they pressed against the plate beside hers, images of Pete flashing with bittersweet clarity across her mind. She had watched his plane go down in flames even as what was left of their group fled yet another Terminator attack. Blair hadn't had a chance to say goodbye to him, or to give him a final kiss. She hadn't even been able to give him a proper burial. But she could make sure his call sign remained his. That much she could do. That, and do her absolute damnedest to make sure his death ultimately counted for something. Okay, that should be enough, Wince said, breaking into her thoughts. Let her go and see if she stays put. Keep your toes out of the way, though, just in case.
Carefully, they eased their hands off the plate. Blair watched it closely, but it showed no signs that it was even thinking about coming off.
Perfect,
Wince said after a minute.
It should survive the night just fine. Thanks.
No problem, Blair said, peering at her plane's underside. The missile pylons, she noted, were still empty. You'll be rearming me once you get all the holes fixed?
You mean the holes, the hydraulics, and the left aileron? Wince asked.
Blair grimaced. I thought the aileron was acting a little funny.
It's not just funny, it's hilarious, Wince said dryly. But I think I'll be able to sober it up a little.
I know you will, Blair said. You can do anything.
But? Wince asked.
Blair frowned. But what?
Come on, Blair, Wince said with a knowing look. Flattery is always followed by an insane request. Go ahead, but do bear in mind that I've only got 3 sidewinders left, and even I can't make new ones out of cheese and 10-year-old Army MREs.
I wasn't going to ask for more sidewinders, Blair protested, mentally scratching them off her list. I was just going to ask you if you could give me a few extra rounds for my GAU-8 this time.
And how would you suggest I do that? Wince asked. Those ammo drums only come in one size.
I know, Blair said, but we just agreed that you can do anything.
You agreed I could do anything, Wince said. I'm not sure my vote was even asked for, let alone counted. Wouldn't it be simpler to just lighten up on the trigger a little?
It's not that I'm spinning them too fast, Blair said. It's that Skynet always seems to know when I'm dry. I swear the damn computer's counting every round as it comes out.
Actually, probably is, Wince conceded. No, really, it's a fine idea. I just don't know if I can...
Shh! Blair cut him off, snapping up her hand for silence. A familiar hum had appeared at the edge of her consciousness, the low-pitched vibration of an HK's turbofans working its way through the hangar's walls. Wince had heard it too. He nodded understanding, his face drawn and tense. The hum was getting louder, and suddenly the hangar's boarded-up west wall exploded into 100 fiery spots and slashes of light as the HK's searchlights found their way through the cracks and gaps. Wince twitched, but remained silent. Blair found her hand again gripping her holstered gun. Pure reflex. It would be a lucky shot indeed that would let even the Eagle's .44 caliber rounds do anything against one of Skynet's flying horrors. The angle of the light shifted as the HK passed overhead, and for a few seconds it was the ceiling, not the wall, that was leaking intense beams of light. Abruptly, the lights went out. Blair held her breath, peering into the darkness, trying to figure out if the HK's rumble was moving away or circling back for a second look. And then the light reappeared, coming through the series of cracks and gaps in the east wall. But this time it wasn't the eye-burning, full-power glare of the HK's searchlights. It was the softer glow of that same blaze, as it was reflected from the ground and rubble in distant buildings. Blair and Wince looked at each other, and Wince puffed out his cheeks in a pantomimed, puffy sigh. Blair nodded, then lifted a finger to her lips to remind him not to make any actual noise until the HK had left the area. Wince nodded in turn, and together they waited as the growl turned again to a distant hum, then faded out completely.
That's the sort of nonsense we've had to put up with all day, Wince murmured, making a face as he stretched muscles and joints that had been frozen too long in the same position. God, but we're vulnerable here. The sooner Connor gets us out of L.A., the better.
Blair ran her fingers gently through the jagged rims of the bullet holes in her plane. He was right, of course.
Skynet had way too good a bead on them here, and the noose was only going to get tighter each time they were forced to run from one rat hole to the next. But where could they go? LA surrounded them for dozens of kilometers in every direction. A hell of a long walk when you had to carry everything on your own back. The team itself had no vehicles, and even if they could find a truck that still worked, there was no gasoline to put into it. But that was Connor's problem, not hers. He would figure something out. He always did.
At least until then, we've got this nice building to keep the rain off, she said.
Actually, a little rain would be nice, Wince said almost wistfully. Might clear the air a little. He shook his head. Anyway, you'd probably better get back to the bunker, get some food, and then get to bed.
Don't worry about me. I had almost 6 hours last night, Blair said. I was just thinking you probably need more sleep than I do. She cocked her head. And food, too.
I've got some lunch over there I never got around to eating, Wince said, nodding toward the back of the hangar. We could split it if you'd like.
No, that's okay, Blair said.
Wince was famous for trying to foist food off on people he suspected were hungrier than he was. Blair had fallen for that trick 5 times in a row before she'd finally caught on.
I'm not hungry.
That was your stomach sending out audible distress signals, wasn't it? He reminded her dryly. Come on, there's plenty of food for both of us.
In which case, we can deduce that you missed at least 2 meals, not just 1, Blair countered. So, go eat, then get some sleep. That's an order.
Wince shook his head sadly. You young people, he said mock-mournfully. Always ordering around your elders.
Call it enlightened self-interest, Blair told him.
She had a few tricks of her own after all.
I don't want someone tired and hungry working on my plane.
Ah, Wince said. Well, when you put it that way.
I do, Blair said. Now go. I'll stay here until Yoshi gets back.
Okay, Wince said. Thanks, Blair. He touched her shoulder, almost shyly. Don't worry. I'll find a way to get you those extra rounds.
Thanks, Blair said. You pull it off, and I guarantee they won't go to waste.
I know they won't, Wince said. See you later. He headed off toward the back, where the hangar's compact housekeeping corner had been set up. Blair waited until he was digging ravenously into his neglected food pack, then took a few minutes to wander around the hangar, checking on the security of walls and boarded-up windows and doors. By the time she'd finished her tour, Wince was stretched out on one of the hangar's 2 sleeping mats, sound asleep. Blair shook her head. A meal that disappeared that quickly had definitely not been enough to share. Just as well she hadn't let him talk her into it. Her stomach rumbled again. Ignoring the emptiness down there, she picked up the other sleeping mat and moved it to a spot where she could keep a simultaneous eye on the door, both of the planes and Wince. Drawing her gun, she sat down on the mat, laying the weapon beside her. Nearly out of fuel, nearly out of spare parts, nearly out of ammo, nearly out of food. Life, she reflected, was definitely not looking good for the good guys. All the more reason to be glad this mess was in Connor's hands, not hers. She just hoped he could still find a trick or two up his sleeve.